Thank you very much, Justin. That was a real education. I think I should mention that Justin and I are working in the same, I guess you would call it a virtual research centre where people from different universities in different places are working on tropical Queensland restoration and, well, I'm in restoration and conservation issues. And so I've heard a bit of your work before, but I've never seen it presented in such a really convincing and coherent whole. And I think Justin's work demonstrates a more general point, which is quite important, and that is how people do science. Increasingly nowadays, of course, we need money to do our work, and we're granted money, and we have to produce a research plan, so maybe for the next 4 years, which says, I'm going to do this and this and this, and I'm going to discover this and this and this, and that's why you should give me the money. And so that constrains us to only discovering things that we already know about. And, well, I guess the other thing within a PhD is you do have some freedom. And so Justin just gave us a really, really good example of how you respond to things that you observe while you're doing the work. When he planned his PhD, he didn't plan for there to be a hot year or for flying foxes to die off. And if he'd had a rigid and good plan which he had stuck to, he might have never done this work, which would have discovered new and important things. So because he was able to respond to the fact that a die-off occurred and then go and plan more research along those lines, we are now discovering information about threats to biodiversity in the future and how they work, which we would have never anticipated 10 years ago. So that is an important lesson. And I think if you weren't convinced already, of course, you would have been convinced that climate change is real and severe. And what you may not have been so aware of is how important extreme heat events can be. And for those of you, I know there'll be a number of you who are very interested in flying foxes, how sensitive flying foxes are to those heat events. Black flying foxes in particular, which although they're tropical species, are not really constructed to cope with the kinds of extremely high temperatures which we paradoxically find in the southern parts of this continent. And this makes, well, the other part of this is that flying foxes in the future are going to face more of these extreme heat events. And at the end, we have the question, how vulnerable are other animals to these same things? I want to shift tack just a little bit. Again, talking about PhD students, we saw in Justin's work that he made an observation and he built on it. I want to flesh out some information about flying foxes in southeast Queensland, which is based on the work of Billy Roberts. I think a number of you probably knew Billy in the flying fox community, who also studied flying foxes for a PhD. And a few years ago, produced a series of reports from that. And so there are reports about flying fox camps and how they're managed. And one of those is a glossy fact sheet, which there were copies on the table out the back. There's information about long-term distributional changes and large-scale movements. and a couple of species. And if you're interested in following up on the biology of flying foxes, you can find most of those on the web by putting the titles into a web browser. One of the things was something that Justin already referred to, and that is the shift in distribution of the black flying fox. And here are the data back to the early 1800s showing the northern and southern limits of their ranges. The grey-headed flying fox down here remains the same, and the black flying fox starts off in the 1800s, much more further north than the grey-headed, and over time the number of observations of both species increase, but basically the black is moving south, whereas the grey-headed is staying in the same place. So that raises a lot of very interesting questions about these fascinating animals and what's going on, which I won't talk about at all. Then we have the other very interesting question about flying foxes and what's going on, and that relates to their mobility, which can nowadays be studied with satellite tracking. And so part of Billy's work was to demonstrate their capacity to move over very long distances in a very short period of time. And I understand from Justin that he has a lot more information about that, so you can ask him about that if you're interested. What this means for flying foxes really is that it's a population in Australia. So if something kills all the flying foxes here, that will cause numbers everywhere to go down. Whether the thing killing them is heat waves or control actions being undertaken at camps where they are a nuisance. Justin alluded to the fact that they are important pollinators and seed dispersers, and they do that by moving between roosts and feeding sites. And this gives you an idea of the range of distances that they might move in a night while feeding, from only a few kilometres up to over 50 kilometres, flying between their roost sites and their feeding sites. And it also shows here that mostly a given flying fox will spend only a few days at a particular feeding site, and the same is true for a roost site. So they are incredibly mobile. They sit here, make some feeding trips. If the food's no good, they go somewhere else to another roost and another feeding site. And that movement, that going somewhere else, may be moving between Brisbane and Sydney. The final piece of biology that is interesting relates to the fact that not only are they important ecologically, but they're important to people because we tend to interact with them in various ways. Love them or hate them, if you look at where they establish, they actually tend to put their camps away from large areas of woody vegetation cover, and they are much more likely to put their camps in proximity to urban development. Which explains why they're in the Botanic Gardens in Sydney. Okay, so I just thought that I should round out the picture by giving you those bits of information which you can also weave into the questions that you have in the general discussion session. Thank you.